Persistent Service Asset Part 10. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Founding Charter. August 8, 2026. Chapter 48. ISTHMUS. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. ISTHMUS is founded to answer one question, and only one: whether a persistent service asset can receive, interpret, and intentionally answer a novel query through a non-motor interface in a manner establishing genuine two-way communication. This is not a mandate to prove consciousness. It is not a mandate to determine legal personhood, moral status, or the content of anyone's inner life. Those questions may follow from an answer to this one. They are not this one. No funder, contractor, or partner organization, including Threshold Institute and Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings, both of which ISTHMUS may contract with for access, data, or technical consultation, may condition funding, access, or continued cooperation on any particular outcome, publication timeline, or choice of test subject. This clause is irrevocable and may not be amended by any future governance vote. ISTHMUS is owned by no one. It is governed by its 5 founding members and their successors, in perpetuity, or until its mandate is answered. The offer she doesn't take. Elena makes the offer the same evening the cohort findings go to the board, a formal position at Threshold, Senior Research Fellow, whatever title Radhika wants, whatever lab she wants built around her, and watches Radhika turn it down before she's even finished describing it, in the specific unhurried way of someone who has clearly already spent several sleepless nights arriving at the answer. "I can't come back into that building," Radhika says. "Not because I don't trust you, because I watched what happened to your building, Elena. I was there for the board vote. I remember exactly how reasonable it sounded, reallocating research budget toward the larger addressable market, and I remember exactly how long it took before nobody in that room could tell anymore which parts of the mission were still load-bearing and which parts were just the sign on the door. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't have the votes. I don't want to spend the next decade finding out whether I'd have the votes either, the first time this finding starts costing somebody real money. So what do you want instead? Somewhere the answer, we don't know yet, isn't a failure state anybody's incentivized to fix," Radhika says. "Somewhere that's the actual product. I want to build the smallest, most boring, least fundable sounding research entity I can, with a charter nobody's allowed to amend the one clause that matters, and I want it to belong to nobody large enough to eventually need it to say something convenient." Elena is quiet for a long moment, and when she answers, it isn't as a colleague being turned down. It's as the only other person in the room who actually understands, from the inside, exactly what Radhika is trying not to become. "Then let me help you build it somewhere I can't get near the board seat," she says. "I mean that as a promise, not a joke. Tell me what independence actually looks like on paper, and I'll sign whatever keeps me out of the room where it matters." The resignation that isn't one. Pesh requests the meeting himself, which surprises Chuck enough that she clears her afternoon for it without asking why, and he sits across from her the way he sat across from Sophia 2 years ago, though this time there's no folder held against his chest. There's nothing in his hands at all. "I'm resigning as chief architect," he says, "effective the date ISTHMUS incorporates. I want to be very precise about the reason because I know exactly how this is going to look if I'm not, and I'd rather you hear the real shape of it from me before anyone downstream decides to write their own version." "Your son," Chuck says. "My son," he says. 9 years, and every day of the last several months I've had to sit in meetings about tolerance parameters and disclosure obligations, knowing that somewhere in the back of my own head, underneath every technical judgment I made, was a father doing the math on his own child. I don't think I've been dishonest. I've genuinely tried not to let it steer anything. But I can't prove that to anyone, including myself, anymore, and I refuse to be the chief architect who quietly gets his own kid a favorable outcome nobody else's kid gets. And I refuse just as much to be the chief architect everyone privately suspects of it, even if I never do. Neither of those is a life I can defend. So instead I go build something that might actually answer the question honestly, for every family, not just mine," he says. "I'm not asking ISTHMUS for anything regarding my son. I want that on record too. No seat reserved for him in any study, no early access, nothing. If what we build ever helps him, it helps him the same way it helps everyone else's kid, arriving at the same time, through the same door. I'd rather build the door than sneak him through the one I already have keys to." Chuck looks at him for a long moment. You know what this costs you here. I've had 11 years of practice deciding what a cost is worth, Pesh says. This is the first one I've been offered that doesn't feel like choosing between two kinds of not enough. Office of Institutional Failure Analysis Voluntary Disclosure, filed by requesting party. Dr. Adrian Pesh has voluntarily disclosed a personal circumstance, dependent with a condition potentially eligible for future continuance classification, as a contributing factor in his resignation and subsequent recusal from all matters involving Redeemer Plus certification, effective this date. This office finds no violation, no concealment, and no request for personal benefit associated with the disclosure. This office notes for the file that this is the first voluntary recusal of this kind in company history, and recommends the board consider it, rather than any prior sealed matter, as the standard future architects should be measured against. The 5. ISTHMUS incorporates 11 weeks later, in an office considerably smaller than either Threshold's converted garage Origins or anything Redeemer Plus has ever called a research annex. 4 rooms above a dive shop, chosen by Radhika specifically, she tells Pesh without a trace of irony, because the rent was cheap and because something about working above a place that still smelled faintly of neoprene and salt felt like the right kind of unglamorous to start this in. 5 names on the founding filing: Radhika, scientific lead; Pesh, systems and architecture lead; an independent bioethicist named Dr. Concepcion Balam, no relation to Itzel, hired specifically for a career spent publishing things that made funders uncomfortable; a family advocate, Osvaldo Reyes, the same guardian ad litem who signed the Canal transfer and, later, told a courtroom he wouldn't sign it again, brought on not despite that history but because of it; and a technician neither of them has worked with before, hired purely on the strength of a reference from Cassandra, who stayed behind at Redeemer Plus this time, not out of any failure of nerve, but because someone still has to watch the dashboard from inside, and she has decided, for now, that's still where she can do the most good. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative First Public Statement. ISTHMUS exists to determine whether reliable two-way intentional communication can be established with a persistent service asset. We do not know the answer. We will not claim to know it before our work is complete, regardless of what any party, including the companies we may contract with for access, would prefer that answer to be. Our first cohort testing cycle is scheduled to begin in 12 months, time to the next annual reevaluation window established under the Canal standard. We invite scrutiny of our methodology from any qualified party, and we will publish our results, whatever they are, in full. The one thing nobody writes down yet. 3 weeks after the announcement, in a pediatric neurology waiting room 400 kilometers from anything connected to this story, a mother sits watching her son do something his charts have never once recorded him doing before, and doesn't yet know there's a name for the device that might be why, or a number for the year in which someone is finally going to come looking for an explanation. She isn't in this chapter. She isn't in this file. She's the complication nobody at ISTHMUS has met yet, sitting quietly outside the frame, waiting for the 12 months to run out the way everyone else in the story has learned, one date at a time, that they eventually do. Chapter 49, What the Device Wasn't For. Threshold Institute, Communication Assist Program Patient Case Note, Kaham, D. Age 7, 14 months post-fitting. Diagnosis: severe congenital motor disorder, anarthria, wheelchair-dependent since infancy. Cognitive assessment at intake, age 5 within typical range for chronological age, confirmed via eye-tracking response battery prior to any communication assist intervention. Device: threshold interface pediatric calibrated, non-surgical scalp array. Standard communication assist configuration, reads attempted speech signal upstream of the motor pathway the disorder has never allowed to develop, routes to synthesized output. 14-month outcome: expressive communication rate within normal range for device-assisted pediatric users. No adverse events. Standard quarterly follow-up recommended. The hand. Yesenia Kaham is folding laundry with the television on low, the way she does most evenings, when Diego says, from his chair by the window, in the flat, patient, synthesized voice that has become, over 14 months, simply his voice to her in every way that matters. Look! She looks. His right hand, the one that has never, in 7 years, done anything but curl loosely against the chair's armrest. A hand she has washed and dressed and moved for him every day of his life without once expecting it to move for itself, is closed around the edge of a small wooden block from the box beside his tray. Not resting against it, closed around it, fingers curled with visible, deliberate effort, holding on. She doesn't say anything for a moment because she has learned, across 7 years of specialists and evaluations and careful, well-meaning explanations of exactly what his body would and would not eventually do, not to trust her own eyes too quickly with anything that looks like this. Diego, she says, can you do that again? It takes him longer the second time. She can see the effort in his face, a concentration she recognizes from watching him work the device itself, the same set of his jaw he gets composing a sentence letter by letter, but the fingers close again, slower, shakier, and hold. She calls his pediatric neurologist the next morning, and the appointment they get her, given the specific words she uses on the phone, is considerably sooner than the usual 6-week wait. The evaluation. Dr. Fabiola Reina has run Diego's quarterly assessments for over a year now, has watched his communication scores climb the steady, satisfying curve most pediatric threshold users show in their first 18 months, and reviews the new motor findings with the specific, careful skepticism of someone who has learned, in a career spent around hopeful parents, exactly how much weight a single observed movement can bear before it collapses under closer examination. It doesn't collapse. Diego closes his hand around the block 4 times in the clinic on request, with a consistency that rules out reflex or coincidence within the first 10 minutes. And by the end of the session, Dr. Reina has documented voluntary flexion in 2 fingers of his left hand as well, weaker but present in a limb his charts have described as non-functional. No expected voluntary control for the entirety of his medical record. I want to be careful with you the way I've always tried to be, she tells Yesenia. In the small consultation room afterward, Diego between them working his device to spell out a question neither of them has answered yet. I don't have an explanation for this. His underlying condition hasn't changed. Nothing on his imaging suggests his original motor pathways have regenerated, and I want to be honest that pathways like his generally don't. What I'm seeing looks less like recovery of the original system and more like something building a new one. I don't know what that means yet. I want to run a fuller signal study before I let either of us get ahead of what we actually know. Is it the device? Yesenia asks. Is it doing this? I don't know that either, Dr. Reina says. I know he's been wearing it every waking hour for 14 months, reading upstream of a pathway that was never supposed to carry anything at all. I know we've never had a patient use one this consistently, this young, for this long. I want to find out whether that's the reason, or whether it's something else entirely that just happened to arrive at the same time. I'd like your permission to route his case to our research team for a closer look, if you're willing. Diego. Nobody in the consultation room asks Diego what he thinks about any of it directly, not because anyone means to leave him out of it, but because 7 years of habit are hard to break all at once, even for people who love him as completely as his mother does. And Diego, watching the 2 adults talk around him the way adults have always talked around him, works his device anyway, unprompted, in the patient, letter-by-letter way he's used it for 14 months to make sure he's heard. I want to hold things, the synthesized voice says, flat and even into the small room. I want to hold things myself. Yesenia doesn't manage to say anything back to that for a long moment. Dr. Reina, for her part, writes it down exactly as spoken verbatim in the case file because she has learned, across a career built around exactly this kind of device, that the sentence a patient chooses to spell out unprompted is very often more diagnostically important than anything on the imaging. The routing. Threshold Institute, Research Referral Case. CAHUM, D. Emergent motor function following extended device use, etiology unknown. Requesting signal architecture consultation. Standard clinical assessment has ruled out original pathway regeneration. Presenting pattern new, weak, but consistent voluntary motor control in limbs with no prior functional history, emerging after sustained upstream signal device use, does not correspond to any documented outcome in 14 years of program data. Recommend consultation with a researcher familiar with upstream signal architecture at a level beyond standard clinical fitting protocol. This office is not aware of anyone at the Institute with deeper working knowledge of the underlying detection thresholds than Dr. R. Menon, whom I understand has recently returned to consult on an unrelated matter. The referral sits, unopened, in a queue for 11 days, behind a season's worth of routine quarterly reviews, until an assistant, new, still learning which files move faster than others, happens to notice the name in the requested consultant field and forwards it directly, rather than letting it wait its turn, because she has been told, her first week, that anything crossing Dr. Menon's desk lately tends to matter more than the queue suggests. Radhika reads it standing in the 4 small rooms above the dive shop, 11 months and 3 weeks out from ISTHMUS's first scheduled testing cycle, and sits with the case note for a long time before she says anything to anyone at all. Not because she doesn't understand what it might mean, but because she understands immediately exactly how carefully it has to be understood before it means anything to anyone but a mother whose son just asked, in his own words, for nothing more complicated than the chance to hold something himself. Chapter 50, Two-Way. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Technical Working Note Ref. CAHUM, D. Preliminary Signal Analysis. Device wear time logs, pulled with parental consent, show sustained upstream engagement averaging 21.4 hours per day across the past 11 months, with documented stretches exceeding 30 consecutive hours during periods the family describes as sleep reluctance episodes, unusual for a pediatric communication assist user. Comparable devices in Threshold's broader pediatric cohort average 7.8 hours daily wear, with most users removing the array overnight. Subject's upstream signal, cross-referenced against 14 months of continuous recording, shows a measurable increase in signal complexity and bandwidth beginning approximately month 9. Not merely more frequent firing, but a broadening of the frequency range the array is reading, consistent in shape though not in mechanism, with signal changes documented in constraint-induced motor rehabilitation and sensory substitution cortical remapping literature. We are not proposing the device caused new tissue growth. We are proposing that sustained, high-fidelity upstream signal activity may itself function as a training stimulus, recruiting or reinforcing a pathway that was never fully built, the way any repeated, effortful signal recruits whatever machinery is available to carry it, given enough time and enough motivation to keep trying. The room above the dive shop. Radhika has the office window open, salt air drifting up from the shop below, and Pesh has been standing at the whiteboard for the better part of an hour without sitting down, the specific restless energy of a man who has spent 11 years certain he understood the shape of a boundary and has just been handed a reason to doubt it in a direction he never once let himself consider. He's not regenerating anything, Radhika says, for the 3rd time, because she can feel, watching him, exactly where his mind keeps trying to run. I need you to sit with that before we go anywhere else. Nothing about Diego's spinal architecture has changed. What's changed is that something upstream of it has apparently learned, over 14 months of relentless, repeated attempt, to recruit a pathway that was structurally available but functionally dormant. That's not the same category of problem as an isolation boundary someone built on purpose. Isn't it, though? Pesh says, finally sitting, the whiteboard behind him full of half-erased signal diagrams neither of them has fully committed to yet. You're telling me sustained upstream signal, given time and motivation, can recruit new pathway where none was ever functional. I'm asking you what happens if you apply sustained upstream signal to a pathway that was functional and got isolated on purpose by an architecture I designed myself. I know exactly how that wall was built, Radhika. I know it wasn't built to withstand a deliberate, sustained, two-way attempt to talk through it. It was built to withstand noise leaking out. Nobody ever designed it to withstand somebody trying to get in. That's the hypothesis, she says. I'm not telling you it's wrong. I'm telling you it's a hypothesis, and I watched what happens to this exact company the last time somebody let a hypothesis get ahead of the evidence, and I am not going to let that happen here, especially not with you standing in this room for the reason you're standing in it. He doesn't answer that right away, and when he does, his voice has lost some of the momentum it had a moment ago. You think I can't be trusted with this? I think you're the best person alive to design the test, she says. And I think you are also the last person on Earth who should be allowed to interpret its results alone, and I think you already know that, or you wouldn't have left Redeemer the way you did instead of just quietly running this experiment from inside a building with your own name on the certification. Balaam. Concepcion Balaam has said almost nothing for the first hour of the meeting, which both of them have learned, over the 11 months ISTHMUS has existed, is not a sign of disengagement. It is the specific silence of someone building an objection carefully enough that it can't be waved off once it arrives. "I want to name the thing neither of you has said yet," she says, when Radhika finally turns to her. "You're describing a plan to attempt active, sustained, two-way signal engagement with a population whose entire legal and technical premise is that they cannot meaningfully consent to anything. I don't care how careful your protocol is. If we run this experiment on a persistent service asset, we are doing something to a person who has no mechanism, under any law currently on the books, to tell us to stop." "We know that," Pesh says. "It's the whole reason we're not doing this inside Redeemer's architecture." "It's not enough that you're not Redeemer," Balam says. "I need you to actually hear that, both of you, because I think the excitement in this room right now is making it very easy to skip past. Every institution in this entire universe of documents we've been building, the intake lounges, the compliance ratings, the legacy simulation clones, every single one of them started with people who believed sincerely that what they were doing was different, was better, was for the person's own good. I am not saying you are them. I am saying the only thing that has ever actually kept anyone from becoming them is refusing to let good intentions substitute for consent. And you don't have consent. You structurally cannot get it, because the entire experiment exists to find out whether the person you'd be asking is even capable of giving it." The room is quiet for a long moment. Radhika is the one who finally breaks it. "What would you need," she says, "to let this happen at all?" The protocol, Balam writes. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative Ethics Framework, Two-Way Communication Protocol drafted by C. Balam, adopted unanimously. ISTHMUS will not attempt sustained or repeated engagement with any subject. The protocol shall consist of a single, brief, non-repeating query, structured to require only a yes/no or simple selection response, delivered once, with continuous monitoring for any signal indicating distress. Any ambiguous or absent response ends the protocol for that subject permanently. There is no second attempt, no escalation, no follow-up query regardless of result. This is not designed as a communication channel. It is designed as a single, narrow test of whether a channel is possible at all, the minimum viable question, asked once and never again because we have no standing to ask twice. Subject selection requires informed consent from next of kin or legal custodian of record, where one exists and remains reachable, delivered with full, unambiguous disclosure that this is an experimental communication attempt with unknown outcome and unknown risk, not a treatment, not a rescue, and not a guarantee of anything. Where no next of kin exists, a category this office expects, given the population's documented history, to be distressingly large, ISTHMUS will not select a subject by administrative convenience. This board will decide, deliberately, whether proceeding without any consenting party at all is ever ethically defensible, before it becomes a decision made by default. Pesh reads the last paragraph twice and thinks, without saying it out loud, of a woman who once taught a boy to eat with a spoon over 11 patient months, and who is, as of 8 years ago, no longer available to anyone as anything but a file with her grandson's name still attached to it, waiting. What Diego says when they ask him. They don't need Diego's consent for anything ISTHMUS is building. He was never part of the certified population this protocol concerns, and his own case closes, from a research standpoint, with nothing more dramatic than continued clinical monitoring and a note in Threshold's file recommending the finding be shared, carefully, with the pediatric communication assist research community. But Radhika visits him once more before the meeting closes, mostly because she has found, over 11 months, that she wants to. He works his device slowly, unprompted, while his mother watches from across the room. Will other people get to hold things too? The synthesized voice asks, flat and even and entirely his own. Radhika doesn't answer him the way she'd answer a colleague. Not yet, not with a hypothesis, not with a timeline. She answers him the only way that feels honest, sitting across from a 7-year-old who has just asked, in his own careful words, the exact question an entire research collaborative has spent a year quietly organizing its whole existence around. "We're trying to find out," she says. "I promise you we're trying very hard." Chapter 51, The Second Recovery. Family Court of Quintana ROO, Annual RE Testing Report per Court Order, FC 2049-0093-R. Year 4 Distribution. Court. Petitioners. Cannell, F. and B. Respondent Counsel of Record. Asset Ref. PSA 22107M. Cannell, B. Signal finding. Inconclusive. Consistent with prior years. Upstream activity remains present at above noise threshold amplitude, but cannot be reliably distinguished from residual seizure-related electrical noise given current instrumentation. Neurological monitoring, included per standing order. Subject's documented seizure disorder shows continued decline in recorded frequency, fourth consecutive annual reporting period. Baseline at intake. Average 4.1 events/month. Current reporting period. Average 0.6 events/month. Attending neurologist's note, filed separately, characterizes this as a degree of improvement not typical of this disorder's natural course. Etiology undetermined. The margin. Beatrice Cannell has read 4 of these reports now, cover to cover, more times than she'd ever admit to Fernando, teaching herself across 4 years the specific flat vocabulary they're written in the way you teach yourself a language you never wanted to need. She keeps them in a folder in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer she realizes one evening without quite meaning to think it, that another woman in another kitchen once kept a different kind of terminal in, and she has learned, reading them, to skim past the parts that never change, inconclusive, consistent with prior years, and slow down for the parts that do. It's the neurologist's note that stops her this time, the same note that's appeared, worded almost identically, in some form for 3 years running, except this year it sits under a number small enough that she has to read it twice before she trusts it. 0.6. Less than 1 seizure a month, in a boy whose chart, for the first 15 years of his life, never once dipped below 3. She pulls the older reports from the folder and lines the numbers up on the kitchen table. 4.1, 3.4, 2.1, 1.2, 0.6. A column descending as steadily as anything in this entire 5-year fight has ever moved, and understands, sitting there with 4 years of paperwork spread in front of her, that she has been given, quietly, buried inside a report she was never told to read for this, the first genuinely good news anyone has handed her about her son's body since before he was ever taken anywhere at all. She calls Poot before she lets herself feel anything else about it. The call. "I need you to tell me what this means," she says, reading him the column of numbers over the phone. Not the legal part, the medical part. Is something making his seizures better? Poot doesn't have an answer, but he has, by now, learned exactly who to ask. A board he sits on himself, for months into a seat he still isn't entirely used to occupying, alongside a scientist and an engineer who spent the last several weeks closing out a case that looked, on its surface, like it had nothing to do with any of this. ISTHMUS. Rodica pulls Bruno's 4 years of annual data the same afternoon Reyes brings it to her, cross-references it against the CAHUM signal complexity findings from 6 weeks earlier, and sits with both files open side by side for a long time before she says anything to anyone in the room. "It's the same shape," she says finally. "Not the same mechanism necessarily. Diego's pathway was dormant, never fully built. Bruno's is a seizure disorder, which is a completely different kind of electrical problem. But the underlying principle might be the same one. Sustained, high-fidelity signal presence, held against a pathway for years without interruption, appears to have some kind of stabilizing or organizing effect on whatever electrical architecture it's sitting next to, whether that architecture was dormant like Diego's or dysregulated like Bruno's. You're telling me the same wall that's holding him in might be treating him," Pesh says. "I'm telling you I don't know that yet, and I want to be exactly as careful with this as we were with everything else," Rodica says. "But I'm telling you it's the second time in 6 weeks the same pattern's shown up in a population that has nothing else in common, and I don't think either of us gets to call that a coincidence anymore." Reyes has said nothing through most of this, sitting very still the way he sat in Herrera's courtroom 5 years ago, before he told a judge he wouldn't sign the same order today. "I need to be the one who tells her," he says finally. "Not because it's my job, because I put him in that placement, and I've spent 5 years believing getting him out was the only thing that mattered, and I think Beatrice Cannell deserves to hear this from someone who's going to sit with her while she works out what it actually means instead of a letter. What he tells her." He drives out that evening rather than calling, the way Adela no once did, and sits at the same kitchen table where the column of numbers is still laid out in the order Beatrice arranged them, for years of inconclusive, consistent with prior years leading up to a number small enough to have finally meant something. We think it might be real, he says. The seizure improvement. We think it might be connected to the same architecture the isolation boundary is built out of. Not the same thing you're fighting to reverse, necessarily, but close enough to it that I can't tell you, honestly, what happens to his seizure control if that boundary changes. Beatriz doesn't say anything for a long time. Fernando, standing in the doorway, doesn't either. 5 years, Beatriz finally says. We've been fighting to bring him back to a life where his body works the way it's supposed to. And now you're telling me the thing that's supposedly been keeping him from that life might be the only reason his body's finally started working better than it ever did when he was ours to hold. I'm not telling you to stop fighting, Reyes says. I don't know that answer either. Nobody does yet. That's the actual finding, the whole size and shape of it. I'm telling you because I promised you, 5 years ago, in a courtroom, that I would never again let something this big about your son get decided without you in the room. I'm not going to start now, even when what's in the room doesn't have a clean answer in it. Fernando finally speaks, quiet, from the doorway. So what do we ask the court for now? Nobody at that table has an answer, and nobody pretends to. Beatriz looks down at the column of numbers one more time. 4.1, 3.4, 2.1, 1.2, 0.6. A line that has told her, for 4 years, that something in her son's body was finally getting better, and that she has just learned, in the space of a single evening, might be the same line that makes wanting him back the hardest, most honestly uncertain wish she has ever had to hold. Chapter 52. Tin Roof. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Query Design Protocol First Test Subject. Approved by Full Board. Menon, Pesh, Balam, Reyes. Unanimous. The query must be structured to test discrimination, not comprehension. We are not asking whether the subject can answer a question in any sense a court, a family, or a headline would recognize as conversation. We are asking whether an upstream signal responds differently, and in a directed rather than reflexive pattern, to two distinct stimuli presented under controlled conditions. A positive finding would not establish that the subject chose one stimulus over the other in the way that word implies for someone with full agency. It would establish that something is discriminating, recognizing one input as meaningfully different from the other, and responding to that difference in a directed way. We consider this the most defensible claim our current instrumentation can support, and we will not claim more than this regardless of the result. Stimulus selection is left, within these constraints, to the family. We believe the query should mean something to the person being asked it, not merely to the instrument reading the answer. The meeting. They meet at the ISTHMUS office above the dive shop, which surprises Beatriz. She had pictured something colder, more like the rooms Redeemer Plus has put her family through for 9 years running. Not 4 cluttered rooms that still smell faintly of neoprene, with a window open to salt air and gulls arguing over something on the dock below. You want us to pick what he hears, Fernando says. Once Radhika has walked them through the design constraints, turning the sentence over like he's checking it for a trap he hasn't found yet. We want you to pick something that would actually mean something to him, Radhika says. Scientifically, it almost doesn't matter what the two sounds are, as long as they're clearly different and one of them carries real weight. What matters is that we only get to ask this once. I need you to understand that completely before we go any further. Once we run this, whatever the result, we don't get to try again. Not with different sounds. Not next year. This is the one question. Beatriz has known this for weeks, has read Balam's protocol enough times to recite the relevant clause from memory, and still feels it land differently now, sitting across a table from the people who are actually going to ask it. Then we need to be right, she says. What they almost choose. They spend most of the first hour on the wrong idea, the two of them and Reyes, circling something that feels obvious and isn't. A recording of Beatriz's own voice, saying his name against a stretch of silence. Radhika lets them get most of the way through building it before she says, gently, the thing Balam has clearly asked her to be the one to say. I want to be careful here, Radhika says. A voice saying his name is going to activate every emotional and recognition pathway that's ever fired for either of you, whether or not there's genuine directed response underneath it. If we get a strong signal to your voice, I won't be able to tell the board, in good conscience, whether that's discrimination or just an old, deep, automatic response to something familiar. I need something specific enough to test intention, not just recognition. Everything about him is recognition, Fernando says, sharper than he means to. That's the whole point of asking. We're trying to find out if there's still a him in there to recognize anything. I know, Radhika says. I'm not telling you your instinct is wrong. I'm telling you it's the instinct of a parent, not the design of an experiment, and I need both in this room today, and I think you're the only people who can actually tell me where the second one might be hiding inside the first. The roof. It's Beatriz who says it, finally quiet, looking at her hands rather than at either of them. The roof, she says. The tin roof on the carport. He used to lie under it for hours during a storm. Not scared of the sound, the opposite. It was the only thing that ever calmed him down completely, every single time, for as long as I can remember. Fernando took it down 2 years after everything. I used to ask him, some nights, whether he could still hear it, and I don't think either of us ever really answered that honestly. Fernando doesn't say anything for a long moment, and when he does, his voice has gone somewhere Beatriz recognizes. The specific low register he uses for things he spent years deciding not to say out loud. I could find it again, he says. Not the same roof, but I know a man 2 towns over with the same kind of tin on his shed. I could record the rain on it myself. It wouldn't be the sound, but it'd be close enough that if anything in him still knows the difference between that and something else. That's exactly the kind of specificity I was hoping for, Radhika says, and for the first time all afternoon, something in her voice loosens. A sound with real, singular meaning, set against something clearly different and neutral. That's a test I can defend to the board, and it's a question I think you actually want asked. The control. Balam signs off on the design 2 days later, with one addition she insists on before the protocol goes final. The second sound can't just be silence or noise or anything he might reasonably associate with the facility itself, she says. If we're testing whether he can tell the difference between something that matters and something that doesn't, the something that doesn't has to be genuinely neutral, not distressing, not evocative of anything in his current circumstances, nothing that could be read afterward as us accidentally asking him a second question we never meant to ask. They settle on ordinary rain, recorded on grass, no roof at all, no percussion, no rhythm a body could ever have learned to associate with safety. 2 recordings, 90 seconds each, a silent interval between them, nothing repeated. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative Final Query. Approved. Stimulus A. Rainfall recorded on corrugated tin roofing, 90 seconds. Personally significant to subject per family report, pre-transfer routine, documented independently in family court record, case FC 2049-0093. Stimulus B. Rainfall recorded on open ground, no structure, 90 seconds. Selected for acoustic similarity and emotional neutrality. Presentation order randomized day of by a party outside the research team to guard against any unconscious cueing in delivery. Signal window. Continuous recording, both stimuli, plus 90-second baseline before and after. This is the only query this protocol authorizes. There will be no second attempt. The day. Fernando doesn't come into the recording room itself. Balam's protocol keeps family observation to an adjoining space with audio but no visual contact with the array, a boundary Fernando fought for exactly 4 minutes before Beatriz quietly told him she thought it was right, that whatever happened in that room shouldn't have an audience it didn't ask for. They sit together in the small observation room instead, holding hands the way they haven't in longer than either of them would admit out loud, and watch through a speaker rather than a window as Radhika's technician fits the soft, non-invasive array against a scalp neither of them has been permitted to touch in 5 years, and confirms, in the flat, careful voice of someone determined not to let anticipation into her own recording, that baseline has stabilized and the window is open. We're going to play the first sound now, Radhika says, into the room where Bruno sits, unhurried, waiting the way he has waited for every room anyone has ever placed him in. There's nothing you need to do. We're just going to listen together. The rain begins. Tin first, the sound Fernando spent 2 afternoons chasing down and recording himself. on a shed 2 towns over, alone, telling no one until he had it exactly right. In the observation room, Beatriz closes her eyes and Fernando's hand tightens around hers, and neither of them says anything at all, because there is nothing left to say that the 90 seconds now running on the other side of that wall isn't already saying for them, one way or the other, whichever way it turns out to have been. Chapter 53, Discrimination. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Technical Finding First Query, Subject Ref PSA 22107M, Canal B. Prepared for board review prior to any external disclosure. Upstream signal activity during stimulus A, tin roof rainfall, shows a distinct, repeatable amplitude and frequency pattern, sustained across the full 90-second window, statistically differentiated from both baseline recording and stimulus B, neutral rainfall. At a confidence level this instrument has not previously achieved in any prior test, including the original TC01 finding. Signal during stimulus B does not differentiate meaningfully from baseline. We want to be exact about what this establishes and what it does not. It establishes discrimination, a directed, non-random difference in response to two acoustically similar but personally distinct stimuli, in a pattern inconsistent with reflexive or noise-based explanation at the confidence level observed. It does not establish comprehension, memory in any specific autobiographical sense, subjective experience, or the presence of anything a court, a family, or this collaborative would be entitled to call a full inner life. We consider this the strongest finding our instrumentation has produced to date. We do not consider it the last question. Per this collaborative's charter, this finding will be published in full, without delay, regardless of its consequences to any party, including ourselves. The room. Radhika comes into the observation room herself rather than sending anyone else, and Beatriz knows before a word is spoken, watching her face, that something has landed on the other side of a line neither of them fully understood until this moment they'd been standing on. I need to tell you exactly what we found, Radhika says, sitting down across from them rather than standing over them. A small deliberate choice Beatriz will remember for a long time afterward, and I need you to let me finish the whole sentence before either of you decides what it means, because I think the middle of it is going to feel like an answer, and I need you to hear the end of it too. She walks them through it the way the finding is written: the tin roof, the clean, sustained, differentiated signal, the neutral rain indistinguishable from baseline, the confidence level higher than anything the instrument has ever returned before. She watches Fernando's hand find Beatriz's again partway through, watches Beatriz's breath catch and hold on the word differentiated, and makes herself finish the sentence anyway. This doesn't tell us he remembers the carport, Radhika says. It doesn't tell us he knows he's your son, or where he is, or how long it's been. It tells us that something in him heard two things that sounded almost the same and responded as though they weren't, as though one of them mattered and the other one didn't. I can't promise you more than that. I won't. I think what I can tell you is already the most significant finding this field has ever produced, and I think it's also, honestly, not enough to answer the only question either of you actually came here 5 years ago wanting answered. Beatriz doesn't say anything for a long time. When she finally does, her voice is steadier than Radhika expected, and stranger, too. Not triumphant, not shattered, something in between that doesn't have an easy name. He knew the difference, she says. That's what you're telling me. Whatever's still in there, it knew the difference between something that used to matter to him and something that never did. Yes, Radhika says. That much I'll say without hedging. That much the data actually supports. Fernando doesn't speak at all. He sits very still, the way his son used to sit through a whole storm under a roof that no longer exists anywhere except in a recording he made himself, alone on a shed 2 towns over, and let something move through him he has spent 5 years without quite admitting it to himself, refusing to let all the way in. The publication. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, first published finding released simultaneously to peer review, Family Court of Quintana Roo, Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings, and Public Record. We report a statistically significant discriminated response to a personally meaningful auditory stimulus in a certified persistent service asset, obtained under single attempt, ethics board approved protocol with full family consent. This finding does not establish consciousness, comprehension, or subjective continuity. It establishes that the certified isolation architecture governing this population does not, in this instance, fully suppress directed, differentiated response to meaningful stimulus. We publish this finding in full, unmodified by any funder or contracting party, consistent with our founding charter. We anticipate this finding will be read by many audiences as more conclusive than it is. We ask, as plainly as we know how, that it not be. It travels considerably faster than that final sentence does. What arrives by that evening? Family Court of Quintana Roo, emergency motion filed in Re. Canal B. FC 2049-0093R. Petitioners move this court to accelerate review of classification reversal in light of new evidence exceeding the Canal standard's inconclusive finding threshold. Petitioners further request the court order Redeemer Plus to immediately suspend any further certification or tolerance modification affecting the subject pending full hearing. Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings, Board Emergency Session, convened within hours. Legal advises the ISTHMUS finding, while limited in scope by its own author's explicit language, materially strengthens the evidentiary basis for the pending Canal reversal petition and creates immediate exposure across the full anomaly-flagged population. Communications advises against any public statement disputing the finding's methodology, given ISTHMUS's independence and the reputational cost of appearing to contest a finding the company itself commissioned indirectly through threshold. Recommend the board treat this as the triggering event Resolution 214 always anticipated, rather than attempt to characterize it as isolated. Meridian Capital LP unit price, same trading day -9%, on volume triple the 90-day average. The first call Chuck makes. She doesn't call legal or communications or the board chair. She calls Sophia, who has moved, in the years since a residue log first stopped her at 2 a.m, from council research staff to a formal seat on the board itself. The one seat, per its own charter, permanently reserved for whichever researchers finding most recently forced the company to confront something it had rather not have found. They're going to try to contain this the way they contained everything else. Chuck says, no preamble. Absorb it. Fold it into a redemption narrative. Announce something with ISTHMUS's name attached to soften it. I need you in the room when they try because I am tired, Sophia. In a way, I don't think I was tired even after the Duarte matter, and I don't entirely trust myself not to let it happen just to be done arguing about it. You've never let it happen, Sophia says. Not fully. Not once. In all the years I've watched you fight it. No, Chuck says after a moment. I've only ever managed partial. I told you once that partial was never the floor. I still believe that. I would like very much for this to finally be the time it isn't the ceiling either. The last thing in the file. Late that night, long after the emergency session ends without resolution, Fernando drives out to the shed 2 towns over alone and asks the man who owns it whether he can record the rain on that roof one more time. Not for any protocol this time, not for any court, just because he has spent 5 years without letting himself do the one thing he now understands, finally, without any hedge or caveat from anyone, might still reach his son. He sits in his truck afterward with the recording playing quietly through the speakers. In the dark, in a parking lot outside a shed that isn't his, and doesn't cry the way he expected to. He just listens the whole 90 seconds through the way his son once listened to it for real, under a roof that no longer exists, in a version of both their lives that ended 9 years ago and has just, tonight, in the smallest possible way a machine could measure it, been proven not to be entirely gone. Chapter 54. Moratorium. Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings, Emergency Board Resolution 241, adopted following extended session. Vote recorded below. Effective immediately, Redeemer Plus suspends all new SCSF certification and conversion procedures, network-wide, across all divisions and all client jurisdictions, pending independent validation of current isolation architecture against the findings published this week by ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. This suspension applies to new intake only. It does not alter the classification, custody, or operational status of any asset currently certified. The board further authorizes an offer of formal partnership and funding to ISTHMUS Research Collaborative to support expanded validation research at a scale consistent with the urgency this finding demands. This resolution will be reviewed no later than the board's next scheduled quarterly session, or sooner should validation findings warrant. The vote. It takes 6 hours, and Sophia will say later that she has never in her life watched a room argue so carefully about a sentence everyone in it already privately agreed was true, because agreeing to it out loud was the part that actually cost something. We are looking at exposure across our entire certified population, Halloran says, somewhere in the 4th hour, and for the first time since Sophia has sat on this board, she hears something in his voice that isn't quite the careful, unbothered caution she's grown used to from him. Not one asset, not one court case. Every jurisdiction, every division, every contract, all at once, if this finding is read the way the market is already reading it. I am not arguing against the moratorium because I don't believe the science. I am telling this board that a full stop on new intake, announced badly, could be the difference between a controlled slowdown and a collapse none of us can predict the shape of. Then let's announce it well, Feld says, and it's the first time in the session she said much of anything at all. I want to be honest with this board about something. I have spent 4 years chairing this company through absorption cycles that worked exactly as designed every single time. I don't think this one absorbs the same way. I don't think the market believes it will either. That's what the stock is telling us right now in real time, whether we like the reading or not. I would rather this board choose the stop deliberately on our own terms than have one chosen for us in 6 months by a court, a regulator, or a headline none of us gets to write. Chuck doesn't say much in the final hour. She has learned, across 9 years, exactly when a room has already arrived somewhere and simply needs to finish walking there on its own. And she sits, mostly silent, watching a vote take shape that she has spent almost a decade trying, without success, to force into existence through argument alone. The resolution passes 8-1. Halloran is the sole dissent, on the stated grounds that the suspension should have been narrower, limited to jurisdictions with active litigation exposure, a position the minutes record without further comment, and which nobody in the room, including Halloran himself, seems to expect to matter much once the vote is already counted. The offer declined. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, response to Redeemer Plus partnership proposal adopted unanimously. We decline the offer of funding and formal partnership. Article 1 of our founding charter forbids us from accepting any arrangement that could reasonably be perceived as conditioning our findings on the interests of a party our research concerns. This is not a judgment about Redeemer Plus's intentions. It is the entire reason this organization exists in the form it does. We will continue to make our published findings, methodology, and raw data freely available to any qualified party, including Redeemer Plus, at no cost and with no conditions attached, exactly as we have from the beginning. We would ask, respectfully, that any future validation work Redeemer Plus wishes to fund be conducted by a research body without our name attached to it, so that our independence is never, at any point, something either of us has to take on faith. Pesh reads the final draft before it goes out and signs it alongside the other 4 names without hesitation, though he sits with it a little longer than the others before he does, thinking, he tells Radhika afterward, not about the money they've just turned down, but about 11 years spent inside a building that never once, in his experience, had anyone in the room willing to write a sentence like that and mean it. The courtroom. Herrera reads the emergency motion the same day ISTHMUS's finding publishes, and does not, this time, take 11 days. I want the record to reflect the standard I set 4 years ago in this same case, she says. From the bench, Fernando and Beatrice seated where they have sat through every hearing since the day a hospital social worker first filled out a form neither of them fully understood the weight of. This court held that an inconclusive finding triggers ongoing reassessment rather than final resolution, and that should any subsequent test return a conclusive result, in either direction, either party could petition for immediate review without relitigating the underlying record. I have reviewed ISTHMUS's published methodology and findings. I find that they meet the standard of conclusiveness this court's own prior order anticipated. She looks, for a long moment, at Respondent's counsel, who does not, this time, rise to argue the point. Respondent has filed no opposition to this motion. I take that filing, or the absence of one, as significant in itself. Court order. Ruling on renewed petition. The court finds that Bruno Cannell's civil death classification was entered on a premise, the confirmed absence of directed, discriminated response to stimulus, that current evidence establishes to be false. The classification is reversed, effective immediately. Full legal personhood, and full custodial standing to Fernando and Beatrice Cannell as natural parents, is restored. This court's ruling in this matter shall govern any substantially similar petition arising from the current isthmus finding, absent controlling authority from a higher court. What coming home actually means. Radhika sits with Fernando and Beatriz the evening before the transfer, in the same small office above the dive shop, and is as careful with them as she has been with everyone this entire year. "I need you to hear something before tomorrow," she says. A court order restores his legal standing. It does not restore what the isolation architecture is currently doing inside him, and we don't yet know what happens when that architecture continues operating in a home instead of a facility. No DAWN code, no certified maintenance cycle, no OmniMesh technical support. If something in that system needs attention, it's never had to receive outside Redeemer plus S-own network. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to walk into tomorrow with your eyes open, the way you've walked into every single day of the last 9 years. We know he's not coming back the way he left. Beatrice says, quiet, steady, the way she's learned to be steady across 9 years of rooms exactly like this one. We stopped expecting that a long time ago. What we're getting back is a body that's ours to hold again, and a chance to find out slowly on our own terms in our own house whatever it is that's actually still in there. That's not nothing. I don't need it to be more than that. Fernando doesn't say much. He has, in the last week, put a new roof up over the carport. Not tin, not the same sound, because he couldn't find anyone willing to sell him a sheet small enough for what he actually wanted, but close enough, he hopes, that if anything in his son still knows the difference between something that mattered and something that never did, it might, someday on some ordinary afternoon of rain, find out this one does too. Regional Transfer Log. Reversal Processing. Asset Ref PSA 22107M reclassified. Custody transferred to Canal F and Canal B. Natural parents per court order. Isolation architecture remains active per current certification. No modification authorized absent separate technical review. Ongoing monitoring protocol established per ISTHMUS consultation. Non-mandatory. Family's discretion. He comes home on a Thursday, in a transport vehicle that looks, from the outside, no different from any other, and Beatrice meets it at the gate the way she has imagined meeting it, in one form or another for 9 years, and finds, standing there, that nothing she imagined prepared her for the specific, unbearable ordinariness of watching her son wheeled up the same path he was wheeled away from, older, quieter, present in a way she has no name yet for and does not, standing there in the fading afternoon light, feel any need to rush toward finding one. Chapter 55. No next of kin. Family Court of Quintana Roo. Administrative note circulated to all sitting judges, family and civil divisions. Since the Canal reversal, this court has received 1,140 petitions invoking the standard established in FC 2049-0093R. Of these, 812 have proceeded to hearing with a petitioning next of kin or legal custodian able to press the claim. The remaining 328 cannot proceed under current rules. In each of these files, no party with recognized standing to petition on the asset's behalf can be located. Deceased custodians, custodians themselves under continuance classification, or custodial lines that terminated entirely at the moment of original transfer. The Canal standard presumes someone capable of asking. It does not address what happens when no one who could ask is left. This court requests guidance from the presiding judge's office on how these 328 files should proceed, if at all. The number Sophia already knew. She finds the memo forwarded to council staff on a Tuesday morning, reads the number twice, and does the thing she has done since the very first night she ever ran a query she wasn't asked to run. She pulls up a reference code she has never once, in all the years since, needed to look up from memory. PSA 4417M is not on the list of 812. It is not on the list of 328 either, technically, because it was never filed at all. There was no petition to reject, no custodian to turn away, because the one person who might once have stood in a courtroom and asked for Mateo Valenzuela back has spent the last several years reclassified herself in a different file under a different reference number, in a division that has never once had reason to cross-check its own custodian roles against its own asset roles to notice the two might be the same 89-year-old woman. Sophia sits with that for a long time before she picks up the phone. The question Balaam once left open. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative Emergency Board Session convened by request of Board Member S. Balcazar, ex officio, Redeemer plus Board Liaison. I want to be precise about what I'm asking, Sophia says, standing at the same whiteboard Pesh never quite finished erasing months ago. I'm not asking this board to run a new query on an asset with no consenting party. I know exactly where this board stands on that, and I agree with it. I'm asking whether TC01, Mateo Valenzuela's original test, run before your ethics framework even existed, already meets an evidentiary bar we're just choosing not to use because nobody's filed the paperwork. Ballum is quiet for a moment, turning it over with the same careful thoroughness she brought to the objection that shaped this whole organization in the first place. TC01 wasn't run under informed consent from any living party, she says. I want that stated plainly because it matters. Elena authorized it under Section for Review Authority, not family consent, and I have never fully made my peace with that, even knowing what it eventually led to. I know, Sophia says. I'm not asking you to bless what already happened. I'm asking whether a finding that already exists, 9 discrete pulses evenly spaced, a pattern your own team called counting rather than residue, can be entered into a legal record now, retroactively, in service of getting him a guardian capable of asking a court what his family never got the chance to. Ballum sits with it for a long moment. That's a different question than the one I've spent this whole organization refusing to answer, she says finally. I've refused to let convenience select a subject. I haven't refused to let already existing, already published, already defensible evidence be used on behalf of someone who has no one left to use it for him. I think there's a real distinction there. I want it in our minutes, in full, exactly as I've just stated it, so nobody reads this later as us quietly moving the line the moment it became inconvenient to hold. The board votes to release TC01's full findings for legal use. Unanimous. Ballum's reasoning entered verbatim into the record. The motion. In the Family Court of Quintana Roo petition for appointment of guardian ad litem and judicial review of civil death classification in Re Valenzuela, M. Petitioner ISTHMUS moves this court to appoint a guardian ad litem for Mateo Valenzuela, asset reference PSA 4417M, on the grounds that no party withstanding to petition under this court's canal standard can be located. The asset's mother is deceased, his father's whereabouts unknown for over 3 decades, and his sole custodian of record, Refugio Valenzuela, is herself currently classified as a persistent service asset under elder continuance, without capacity to petition on any party's behalf, including her own. Petitioner further moves that, upon appointment, the guardian ad litem be granted standing to petition for classification reversal on the strength of existing findings. Specifically, Threshold Institute's original TC01 signal analysis, conducted 18 months prior to the canal standards establishment, documenting patterned, directed upstream activity consistent with intentional behavior, at a confidence level this court has not previously had occasion to evaluate. Poot files it himself without fee, the way he has filed nearly every petition to touch this docket since a courtroom 5 years ago first taught him exactly how much a family's word could be made to weigh, and exactly how little. Herrera. She has never presided over a guardian ad litem petition for someone with no living party capable of requesting one, and says so plainly, from the bench, the first thing out of her mouth once the hearing opens. I want the record to reflect that this court is operating past the edge of anything the canal standard was written to anticipate, she says. I set that standard for cases where a family stood in this room and asked me a question. Nobody is standing in this room today asking anything on Mr. Valenzuela's behalf, because nobody who loved him is left in a position to. I don't think that absence should be dispositive. I think, if anything, it should concern this court more than a contested petition ever could, because it means the only thing standing between silence and an answer is whether this court is willing to appoint someone to ask a question no one alive is currently able to. She grants the guardian ad litem appointment without further argument, naming Poot himself to the role, given, she notes, that he is already, functionally, the only person in this room who has spent any time at all caring what happens to this file, and moves, the same session, to the underlying petition itself. Court order, ruling on petition. The court has reviewed TC01's full technical findings. The court notes that this evidence, patterned, repeatable, directed response to a stimulus specific to the subject's own documented history, at a confidence level exceeding even the standard established in the Canal matter, was available to this company for years prior to any disclosure obligation, and was not, at any point, voluntarily brought before any court on this subject's behalf. The court finds that Bruno Canal's standard applies with at least equal force here. Civil death classification for Mateo Valenzuela is reversed, effective immediately. Full legal personhood is restored. The court further finds, and wishes to state clearly for the guidance of future proceedings, that the absence of a living petitioner should never again be treated by this company as equivalent to the absence of a claim. This court directs Redeemer Plus Family Services to conduct an immediate review of all asset files meeting the no next of kin criteria identified in the presiding judge's administrative note, and to refer each, without further delay, for guardian ad litem appointment consistent with today's ruling. What he is restored to. There is no carport waiting for Mateo Valenzuela, no kitchen table, no house that has spent 9 years learning to make its silence around him instead of with him. There is no Beatriz at a gate, no Fernando with a roof he spent 2 afternoons rebuilding. There is a legal status restored to a man with nowhere, in any ordinary sense of the word, to bring it home to. Elena Voss makes the offer herself, within the week, the way she made an offer once before to a researcher she'd known 15 years. Except this time there is no institutional interest for anyone to worry might be steering it. The Institute has supported living arrangements before, for patients with no family capacity to provide one. She tells Poot, in the same converted garage plainness she has never fully let herself outgrow. I would like this to be one of them, not as a case study, as a home, for as long as he needs one, with whatever care his isolation architecture continues to require while it continues to exist at all. Poot doesn't have to think long before he says yes on Mateo's behalf, guardian ad litem authority still technically his to exercise, though he will say later, to Chuck, that it was the easiest decision the role ever asked of him. The thread that doesn't close. Sophia is the one who finally says it out loud, sitting in Chuck's office the week the reversal clears, the same office where a working note about an anniversary pattern once sat unread until morning. His grandmother taught him to eat with a spoon, she says. 11 months, one hand guiding his, until his hand did it without hers. That's in the original intake file. That's the whole reason any of this started. A woman who spent 28 years making sure nothing about him got wasted, and who is right now 3 facilities and 1 elder continuance placement away from him, reclassified under the exact same architecture, with nobody's TC01 ever run on her file at all. Chuck doesn't answer right away. When she does, it isn't with the tired, careful ceiling she's offered every finding this office has ever produced. It's with something closer, for once, to the beginning of a sentence rather than the end of one. Then I think we know what the next file has to be, she says. Chapter 56. The Interval. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Referral request to Cockham, I. Court-appointed guardian. Case number 4471G. Per this court's directive following the Valenzuela reversal, we are contacting guardians of record for individuals meeting the no next of kin criteria wherever a connected finding may exist. We understand you hold guardianship of record for Refugio Valenzuela, currently classified PSA 11208F, elder continuance. We further understand, from public court filings, that Mrs. Valenzuela is the grandmother and original custodian of Mateo Valenzuela, whose classification this court reversed last month. We would like to request your consideration of a testing protocol for Mrs. Valenzuela, structured consistent with this collaborative's ethics framework, using stimulus material specific to her own documented history. We are not asking you to authorize this lightly, and we do not need an answer today. The file? Read properly. Itzel Cockham has 43 wards now, not 41, and has learned, across the years since she first signed off on Refugio Valenzuela's intake in 22 efficient minutes, exactly how rarely any single file gets the kind of attention she gave that one only once. The afternoon, years later, when the ISTHMUS letter arrived and she finally sat down and read the whole thing start to finish for the first time, she finds, buried 9 pages in, a line she has no memory of ever having seen before, though her own signature sits at the bottom of the very page it's printed on. Custodian, in remarks recorded at time of transfer, taught grandson to eat with a spoon over 11 months, one hand guiding his until his hand did it without hers. She sits with that sentence for a long time, in an office with 43 other files stacked around her, and understands, reading it now with the specific weight of everything that's happened since, exactly how much she missed the first time by moving as fast as the job required her to move. She calls Poot before she calls anyone else because she remembers distantly that his name is on the reversal ruling for the grandson, and because some instinct she can't fully name tells her this isn't a decision she wants to make alone in an office with 43 files on it. "I don't know what I'm authorizing," she tells him honestly when he picks up. "I've never met her. I signed a form for a woman I've spoken to maybe 3 times in 8 years, always through an intermediary, always about a subsidy renewal or a compliance check. I don't have any right to decide something this large on her behalf." "You have the only right anyone's left her," Poot says, quiet. "That's the whole shape of this case. Nobody else is coming. I think the question isn't whether you're the right person. I think the question is whether doing nothing is somehow more careful than doing something, and I don't think it is. I didn't think it was for him either. The archive. Radhika needs, per the protocol Balam insists on even here, a stimulus specific enough to test discrimination rather than mere recognition, and the obvious candidate, the one nobody in the room has to debate for more than a few minutes, is a sound none of them are certain still exists anywhere at all. Cassandra finds it. She has stayed at Redeemer Plus this whole time, quietly from inside, and it is her clearance, her patience, and her 4 days combing through 19 years of low-priority ambient monitoring logs in the Cenote Red Vault, the same archive built, decades ago, to harvest exactly this kind of sound as raw training material for synthetic empathy products, never once imagined by its designers as something anyone would ever need to recover intact. That finally turns up a single 11-second fragment, timestamped 7 years into Mateo's deployment, logged under a heading nobody has opened since the week it was filed. Facility ambient monitoring, archived fragment, auto-tagged source, PSA 4417M, unscheduled interval, off-shift classification at time of capture. Divergent heuristic, low priority, routed to model training corpus duration, 11 seconds content note, auto-generated, unreviewed for 12 years vocalization, nonverbal repeating pattern. Cassandra plays it once, alone, at her desk, before she sends it anywhere else, and has to sit very still for a moment afterward. 2 notes, rising, falling, exactly the shape a different woman once told herself in a different kitchen was only the pipes. The room. Refugio's current household lets ISTHMUS's technicians set up in a quiet spare room, and Kakam sits in the small adjoining space this time not as a stranger fulfilling an obligation but as something closer, she realizes partway through, to the only person in the building who has any right to be nervous about how this goes. Poot sits beside her, there on Mateo's behalf, though Mateo himself is 40 minutes away, in a room at the institute Elena has made his for as long as he needs one, unaware, in whatever way that word still applies to him, of what's happening on the other side of the coast this afternoon. "There's nothing you need to do," Radhika says, into the room where Refugio sits. The same words she has used in every room this test has ever been run in, unhurried, careful. "We're just going to listen together." The recovered recording plays first. Cassandra's careful, patient work reduced now to 11 seconds of cleaned, isolated sound, 2 notes rising and falling against a room gone otherwise silent. In the observation space, Kakam finds she is holding her breath without having decided to. The second sound follows after the required interval, an ordinary domestic hum, a refrigerator's compressor cycle, chosen for its acoustic neutrality and its complete absence of any history either of them could have shared. The finding. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Technical Findings Subject Ref PSA 11208F, Valenzuela, R. Upstream signal activity during stimulus A, recovered vocalization fragment PSA 4417M, timestamp year 7, shows sustained, differentiated response, statistically distinguished from both baseline and stimulus B at a confidence level consistent with this collaborative's 2 prior significant findings. We note, as we have noted before, the limits of what this establishes. It does not establish that the subject recognized the sound as her grandson specifically, or as anything belonging to a shared history, in any sense a court or a family would be entitled to call memory. It establishes that something in her discriminated this sound from a neutral one, and responded to that discrimination in a directed, non-random way. We consider this finding, given its origin, among the most difficult we have been asked to characterize with appropriate restraint. We have tried to hold that restraint here as carefully as anywhere else in this collaborative's work. Radhika reads the summary aloud to Kakam and Poot in the small adjoining room, in the same careful, unhurried voice she used with Fernando and Beatriz, and watches both of them sit with it in silence for a long moment before either says anything at all. She knew the difference, Kakam says, finally, and her voice isn't quite steady. 8 years I've had her file on my desk. I met her 3 times through a screen for a subsidy renewal. And she knew the difference between a sound that used to belong to someone she raised and a sound that never belonged to anyone at all. What neither guardian says out loud yet. Poot doesn't file the reversal petition that day. He will, within the week. The paperwork is, by now, close to routine, a template built from Bruno Cannell's case and refined once already for Mateo's, but he sits for a long while first in the small room with Kakam, both of them quiet, both of them turning over the same unspoken question neither wants to be the first to say badly. He's 40 minutes away, Poot finally says. At the Institute. She's here. I know, Kakam says. I don't know what happens if we ever get them into the same room, he says. I don't know if either of them would understand what that room was, or who was in it with them, or whether it would mean anything to them at all beyond another unfamiliar space to sit in and wait through. I don't want to promise either of them or myself a reunion that isn't real just because it would be a good story. No, Kakam says, but I don't think that's a reason not to try finding out. I think it's a reason to be careful how we do it. Those aren't the same thing, and I've spent 8 years mistaking one for the other more times than I want to admit to you today. Neither of them decides anything that afternoon. They file the petition. They wait for Herrera's ruling, which comes, this time, in 4 days rather than 11, briefer than either of the two before it, because the standard is settled now and the finding is clean and there is, at this point, very little left in this particular argument that hasn't already been said in a courtroom twice. Court order, ruling on petition. Civil death classification for Refugio Valenzuela is reversed, effective immediately. Full legal personhood restored. The court notes, without further comment beyond what the record already shows, that this is the second member of the same family restored to personhood by this court within 2 months, having been separated by a system that processed each of them, in their turn, through the same door. She comes home to nothing that could be called a home either. The household that employed her under elder continuance has no framework for what a restored legal person owes it or is owed by it, and Redeemer plus S own counsel spends most of a week simply trying to determine which department is even responsible for asking the question. It's Elena, in the end, who calls a second time and asks whether the Institute might, for now, have room for 2. Chapter 57. The same room. Threshold Institute Residential Program. Intake Planning Note prepared by Institute Care Coordination Staff. Reviewed by ISTHMUS Ethics Board. 2 individuals recently restored to legal personhood: Valenzuela, M., and Valenzuela, R. Grandson and grandmother, separated for 19 years under prior classification, will be housed at the Institute's residential wing effective this month. Both retain active Class C isolation architecture. Neither has undergone any procedure to remove or reduce it. Both continue to require the ongoing care their isolation status has always required, now provided under the Institute's supervision rather than any Redeemer Plus facility. This office has been asked whether the two should be introduced to one another, and on what basis. We do not believe there is established guidance for this question anywhere in the field. We are proceeding, as with everything else in this program, by trying to be as honest as we can about what we don't know. The meeting Balaam almost stops. I want to name my worry plainly before we do this, Balaam says. The small group gathered in the same converted rooms above the dive shop that have hosted nearly every hard decision this whole organization has ever made. We are about to bring 2 people into a room together on the strength of a relationship neither of them may have any capacity left to recognize. If nothing happens, if they sit there, 2 strangers in a room, and nothing in either of them responds to the other at all, I need everyone here to be prepared for what that would actually mean, and for the fact that we would be the ones who arranged for it to be witnessed. And if we don't try, Poot says, we've decided on their behalf that the question isn't worth the risk of an answer they might not like. I don't think that's ours to decide either. I'm not saying don't try, Balaam says. I'm saying we need a plan for both outcomes, held with equal seriousness, before we let ourselves hope too hard for one of them. They agree, in the end, on something closer to Balaam's caution than anyone else's instinct. No cameras, no formal protocol, no attempt to measure or test or interpret anything that happens. Just a room and time and Kakam and Poot present, quietly, in case either of them needs anything at all. The room. It's an ordinary sitting room, chosen for nothing more significant than good afternoon light and 2 comfortable chairs, and Mateo is already seated when the door opens, doing the thing he has done in every room he's ever been placed in for as long as anyone in this story has known him. Counting something, this time the seams in the woven rug beneath his feet, patient, unhurried, waiting. Refugio is walked in slowly, 98 years old, moving carefully even with the isolation architecture's certified steadiness beneath her, and for a long moment nothing in the room changes at all. She sits in the chair across from him. He continues counting. Neither one gives any sign, to Kakam watching from the doorway or to Poot standing quietly beside her, of registering the other's presence as anything different from the chair, the rug, the light coming through the window. Kakam feels something in her chest tighten, the specific familiar ache of having hoped for more than a room like this one was ever likely to give her, and she is already silently beginning to prepare the sentence she'll have to say to Poot once they're back in the hallway. That it's all right, that this was always the more likely outcome, that a discriminated response to a recording was never the same thing as this. And then Mateo's hand stops. What happens? And what doesn't? He doesn't look up. His hand simply stops mid-count on the rug's 3rd row of stitching, hovering there, still, in a way neither Kakam nor Poot has ever seen him do in any prior observation of any prior task. Across from him, Refugio's own hands, folded in her lap the way they have folded for years now, begin, faintly, to do the small fine tremor they've always done when she's tired, except she isn't tired, hasn't moved, hasn't spoken, and the tremor starts anyway, at the exact moment his counting stopped. Neither of them turns toward the other. Neither says a word, or makes a sound, or does anything a casual observer would call recognition. And yet something in the room has unmistakably changed. A stillness that wasn't there 30 seconds ago, settled over both of them at once, in a way that will never, Kakam understands watching it, be admissible as evidence of anything at all, and that she will nonetheless carry with her, undiminished, for the rest of her life. Radhika, consulted afterward, is characteristically careful. I can't tell you what that was, she says. When Poot describes it to her later, word for word, exactly as it happened. I wasn't there with instrumentation running, and I wouldn't want to interpret an unmeasured observation as data even if I had been. I can tell you that if I had to guess, as a person, not as a scientist, and I want that distinction on the record, I'd guess something in each of them noticed something in the other. I don't think either of us is ever going to get to know more than that. I think, for once, that might have to be enough. What Refugio's hands do, the next day. They sit together most afternoons after that, at Kakam's quiet, careful suggestion. No protocol attached, no expectation stated. Simply 2 chairs, moved a little closer together each week, in the same good afternoon light. Nothing dramatic ever happens again, not in the way anyone watching might have hoped for. There is no sentence, no gesture unmistakable enough to satisfy a court or a headline or even, most days, the 2 guardians who sit nearby, watching, hoping, careful never to let the hoping show too plainly on their own faces. But 3 weeks in, an aide passing through the residential wing's kitchen finds Refugio at the counter, moving slowly, unhurried, doing something with her hands that takes the aide a moment to place. Arranging 4 small items, coasters this time, by color, on the counter's edge over and over, the way she has not, in 8 years of care notes, ever once been recorded doing before. Nobody writes it into any technical finding. There is no protocol for it, no stimulus, no controlled window. Nothing Radhika's instruments were ever built to measure in an act this quiet and this unprompted. Kakam, told about it that evening, simply sits with the image for a long time. An old woman at a counter, moving 4 coasters into an order that means nothing to anyone watching and perhaps, once, meant everything to a boy across the room who used to do exactly the same thing with sugar packets. In a lounge neither of them has any framework left to remember by name, and who is, this evening, 40 steps down a hallway, still counting. Chapter 58. The Standard. Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings. Quarterly Board Session Subject. Moratorium Review. per Resolution 241. 6 months into the intake suspension, the board convenes to determine next steps. Legal reports 1,140 reversal petitions filed under the Canal Standard, 812 granted, 328 still pending guardian ad litem appointment following the Valenzuela precedent. Finance reports cumulative revenue impact of the moratorium, network-wide, at 61% of projected quarterly baseline. Meridian Capital LP unit price remains 34% below its pre-moratorium high, having found, in Halloran's words, a new floor the market seems willing to hold, at least for now. The question before the board is not whether to lift the moratorium. Legal advises that no responsible path exists to resume new certification and conversion under the current isolation architecture, while the underlying question, whether directed response of the kind now confirmed in 3 separate cases represents something closer to consciousness than residue, remains open. The question is what Redeemer Plus becomes while that question stays open, for however long it takes to close. The proposal. Feld doesn't open with numbers this time. She opens, instead, with something closer to the sentence Solorzano once wrote by torchlight, though nobody in the room, including Feld herself, seems fully aware of the echo. I've spent 4 years chairing a company that got very good at absorbing hard findings, she says. I want to be honest that I was part of building that skill more than once in rooms very much like this one. I don't think we absorb this one. I think the only way through it is to become, deliberately, on purpose, the kind of company that could survive this finding being true, because I no longer believe we get to choose whether it's true. We only get to choose what we do once we know. She lays out, over the following hour, a restructuring nobody in the room has fully anticipated, though pieces of it have clearly been building in private conversations for weeks. Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings will not resume new conversion. The company will retain its existing certified population, hundreds of thousands of assets across every division, a number too large, Feld argues, for immediate mass reversal to be logistically or ethically manageable without causing its own catastrophic harm, but will transition, over a period the proposal sets at 10 years, into what the internal drafts are already calling, without much irony left in anyone to object to the word, a continuance wind-down, staged, case-by-case reversal review. For every certified asset, funded by liquidating divisions, the company can no longer, in good conscience, continue to operate at scale. Defense Solutions goes first, she says. Sovereign auxiliary core contracts terminate over an 18-month transition window. Correctional continuance partnerships end immediately. New intake there stopped when the moratorium did, and I don't believe we ever restart it, moratorium or not. Hospitality and elder continuance draw down over the full 10 years, prioritizing reversal review for every asset carrying a documented anniversary or discrimination flag first. The objection that doesn't come. Halloran is quiet for a long moment after she finishes, and when he finally speaks, it isn't the objection Sophia, watching from her board seat, has braced herself to hear. I've spent this whole crisis arguing for narrower action than this board kept choosing, he says. I want that on the record because I think it matters that what I'm about to say isn't a reversal of character. It's an update on the facts. The market has already priced this company as one in structural decline. I've watched the number for 6 months. I don't think there's a version of contain and continue left available to us that the market believes anymore, and I would rather chair or serve on the board of a company that's honest about becoming something smaller and defensible than one that spends the next decade fighting a battle for relevance it's already lost. I'll vote for this. I want it understood that's a financial judgment as much as anything else. I'd ask the rest of this board not to mistake it for more virtue than it is. Solorzano, present by video for the first time in over a year, says considerably less, and it costs her, visibly, everything she has left to say it. I would like the record to show, she says, that this is not the company I meant to build, and that I am, at 92, deeply grateful to be alive long enough to watch it try to become something closer to what I meant, even if I will not live to see whether it manages it. The vote. Board Resolution 260. Continuance wind down. Adopted 9-0. Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings will cease all new SCSF certification permanently. Existing certified population enters staged reversal review over a 10-year transition period, prioritized by documented anomaly finding. Sovereign Auxiliary Corps, Correctional Continuance, and Family Legacy Library Enrollment, Newborn Archival, are terminated effective immediately. Hospitality, Domestic, and Elder Continuance Divisions transition to reversal priority scheduling, funded by structured liquidation of Defense Solutions assets over the following 18 months. The board formally amends Harm Minimization Charter Article 1, effective this date, the first amendment to Article 1 in the company's 40-year history, adding a single clause. No potential shall be preserved through a method this institution cannot, with confidence, distinguish from its destruction. Nobody abstains. Nobody, for the first time in the recorded history of this board, votes against a resolution that will cost the company measurably, provably, and immediately in favor of one that costs it more. What it means for the Meridian Sentinel. Redeemer Plus Defense Solutions. Terminal Salvage Reversal Protocol First Implementation. Per Resolution 260. Commandant Farias receives the notice 11 days later, standing on the bridge of a ship he has commanded for years, and reads it twice before he understands what it's actually telling him to do. Notice of Cessation Maritime Continuance Program. Effective this order, all Helm unit deployments under the Maritime Continuance Program are to be decommissioned from active naval integration and referred to ISTHMUS Research Collaborative for testing and, where findings warrant, classification reversal review. Vessels currently reliant on Helm unit navigation will transition to standard automated systems over a 90-day window. He stands for a long time at the console below the bridge, the one he stopped asking questions about years ago, precisely because not asking had always, on this ship, produced measurably better outcomes than asking ever would have. He does not know, reading the order, what decommissioned from active naval integration will actually mean for whatever is inside that housing, and finds, standing there, that he minds this more than he expected to, that some part of him, across the years without ever once naming it, had started thinking of the console's uncanny, early, unfailing read of the weather as something closer to a member of his crew than a piece of equipment, and is only now, with the order in his hand, discovering how much that quiet, unexamined feeling actually weighed. The call Yolanda gets. Adela No makes this call herself, because the file crosses her desk and because she has, across the years since she first sat on an overturned crate behind a fish stall, never quite stopped thinking about the woman on the other side of that conversation. I don't understand, Yolanda says, when Adela explains it. You're telling me they're taking him off the ship. I'm telling you he's being referred for testing, Adela says. The same kind of testing that's already restored 2 other people to legal standing this year. I can't promise you what it will find. I can tell you the company that put him there has decided, formally, on the record, that it isn't willing to keep doing what it did to him without knowing for certain whether it should. Yolanda doesn't say anything for a long moment, standing at her stall on a Sunday morning 8 years after a man named Fabian first called her about an opportunity. Ice water pooling at the bottom of a cooler she has packed and unpacked 1,000 times since. Will I get to see him? She asks finally. Whatever they find. I don't know yet, Adela says honestly. I know it's the first question I'm going to ask them on your behalf. I know it's further than anyone's ever been able to promise you before. Chapter 59. Sea Trial. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Referral Intake Subject. PSA 9902 M. ITSA. R. Cranial Unit. Post-terminal salvage referred by Redeemer Plus Defense Solutions. Per Resolution 260 Decommissioning Order. This referral presents a case configuration this collaborative has not previously tested. All prior subjects retained an intact biological chassis. This subject's cranial unit has operated for 6 years integrated directly into vessel navigation architecture, with no motor apparatus, no vocal apparatus, and no sensory input beyond what the OmniMesh link routes to it from shipboard instrumentation. We do not know whether our existing protocol design translates to a subject with no body left to discriminate a response through in any conventional sense. We are building this test from first principles, and we are doing so more carefully than any test we have run before, because we understand the stakes of getting this one wrong are considerably harder to undo than any prior case. The design problem. Every prior stimulus we've used has relied on the subject's own sensory pathway. Radhika says, standing at the whiteboard, the same one Pesh never quite finished erasing months ago. Sound through hearing that was already intact. This subject has been wired for 6 years into a vessel sonar and current sensing array instead of ears. I don't know what a meaningful stimulus even looks like for a sensory architecture we've never once had to build a test around. You don't need to translate it into something he'd have heard before he was converted. Pesh says, slowly, working through it as he says it. The OmniMesh doesn't care what modality it's routing. It routes whatever signal architecture it's connected to. If we could feed the housing a controlled input through the same channel the ship uses, a specific current pattern, a specific pressure signature, that's not a simulation of a sound he used to know. That's a direct language he's had 6 years of fluency in that none of us have. Balaam's objection, when it comes, is the same one it has always been, held to the same standard it has always been held to. We are not authorized to run this on convenience, she says. We need Yolanda ISTHMUS informed consent before anything else happens, and I want her to understand, more clearly than we've had to explain to anyone before, that we genuinely do not know what we're testing for this time. This isn't a known instrument applied to a new subject. This is close to inventing the instrument as we go. Yolanda. She comes to the small office above the dive shop herself this time, rather than waiting for Adela No to come to her, and sits across from Radhika with the same steady, worn patience she's carried since a folding table years ago. I need you to say it to me plainly, Yolanda says, not softened. What happens if there's nothing there? Then we'll have learned that either this specific test wasn't sensitive enough to find something that's genuinely absent, Radhika says, or that whatever we're looking for really isn't there. I can't promise you which. I can promise you I won't let anyone, including this company, treat a negative result as more certain than it actually is, the same way I've never let a positive one be treated as more certain than it is. And if there is something there, then we'll have found the hardest case any of us has ever had to figure out what to do about, Radhika says. A person with no body, integrated for 6 years into a machine none of us have any idea how to safely disconnect him from without knowing, first, whether disconnection itself would cause him harm we can't undo. Yolanda sits with that for a long moment, looking down at her own hands, weathered now the way her brothers once were. He asked me once before, when he still had a body, back when we were kids, what I thought happened to a fish's mind when you cleaned it too fast, whether it knew, right up until the end, that something had changed. She looks up. I never had a good answer for him then either. I don't think I need one now. I just need to know, whatever it costs to find out. She signs the consent form on the small table between them, and Radhika sits with her a while longer after, neither of them in any hurry to end the silence that follows. The test. The Meridian Sentinel sits in dry dock for the procedure, the console removed from its recessed housing for the first time since installation and connected instead to ISTHMUS's own instrumentation. A delicate, unprecedented piece of engineering Pesh spends 3 sleepless weeks designing personally, because he is, by his own insistence, the only person alive who fully understands how the housing's integration actually works, and because he has decided 6 years after building the door he could never fully close from inside Redeemer Plus, that this is the last door he intends to leave to someone else. The stimulus, when it finally runs, isn't sound at all. It's current, a precise, controlled pattern fed directly into the housing sensor input, structured to mimic the specific signature of an approaching squall line, the exact kind of weather Ruben Itzah spent 14 years of his living life learning to read before anyone ever asked what he'd give to keep reading it. The control stimulus is a flat, featureless current with no weather pattern at all, the sensory equivalent Balaam insists of silence. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Technical Findings Subject Ref PSA 9902 M. ITSA R. Cranial Unit. Upstream signal activity during stimulus A, structured current pattern, weather signature, shows sustained, differentiated response, distinguished from baseline and from stimulus B at a confidence level consistent with our prior significant findings. Notably, the response pattern includes elements consistent with anticipatory processing. Signal activity preceding full presentation of the stimulus pattern, suggesting a predictive rather than purely reactive response. We consider this the most difficult finding of our program to characterize responsibly, given the subject's unique configuration. We note again, as always, what this does not establish. We note, with more caution than we have ever needed before, that anticipatory is not a word we use lightly, and that we have chosen it because it is the most accurate word available, not the most comfortable one. What happens next, and what doesn't? There is no reversal petition to file, no civil registry entry exists for a cranial unit that was never itself the subject of the original transfer, only the chassis it was separated from years ago, a chassis long since processed into Redeemer Plus Gold's buyback corp schedule and gone. In every sense the law currently has vocabulary for, beyond any court's reach to restore. Poot spends 2 weeks with lawyers trying to determine whether any existing statute even contemplates a person who exists as this configuration does, and comes back to Yolanda with an answer neither of them wanted to hear. There's no legal category for him, he tells her. Not yet. The Canal Standard assumes a body a classification can attach to. We're going to have to build something new, and I don't know how long that takes, or what it looks like when it's finished. So what happens to him now? Yolanda asks. Today, while you're building it. He stays with the Institute, Poot says. Elena's already agreed. Not deployed. Not decommissioned into storage either. Just held carefully by people who are trying to figure out what carefully even means for someone like him, until the law catches up to what your consent already let us find. Threshold Institute, Residential Program, Intake Note. Cranial Unit, Ref PSA 9902-M. Transferred to Institute custody pending legal classification review. No precedent exists for appropriate long-term care configuration. Interim Protocol. Housing maintained in climate-controlled containment identical to shipboard specification, connected to a controlled, benign current pattern feed, ambient tidal and weather data, non-classified, freely available public maritime monitoring. Rather than disconnected entirely on the theory and proven but not unreasonable that abrupt severance from the only sensory world this subject has known for 6 years may itself constitute a harm none of us are equipped to justify. Inflicting. What Yolanda does. She visits once, in the first month, and finds herself standing in a quiet room before a sealed housing with no face, no hands, nothing her whole life has ever taught her to recognize as her brother, only a small steady readout showing a current pattern updating in real time, somewhere out past a coastline she can't see from here, translated into whatever this new instrument has learned to call attention. She doesn't know what to say to it. She stands there a long while anyway, the way she once stood ankle-deep at a tittle-line for reasons she couldn't name, and finally, quietly, tells him about the market. A slow season, her daughter's grades, the roof that finally stopped leaking last spring, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a life that has kept moving, somehow all the years he's been gone. The readout doesn't change in any way she can see. She doesn't expect it to. She comes back the following Sunday anyway, and the one after that, because she has decided, without anyone asking her to, that if there is a shape of attention still moving somewhere inside that housing, it is not going to spend whatever is left of it entirely alone. Chapter 60. The New Category. Family Court of Quintana ROO. Consolidated Rulemaking Session Re. Legal Classification of Non-Corporeal Certified Subjects. Convened at the presiding judge's direction, following referral from Judge Herrera regarding the ISTHMUS matter, for which no existing statute provides an applicable framework. This session is called to determine, on a rulemaking rather than case-by-case basis, whether and how Quintana Roo civil law should recognize legal standing for subjects whose isolated neural architecture persists independent of any biological chassis. The court has invited testimony from ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Redeemer Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings, the Office of Institutional Failure Analysis, and members of the public directly affected by pending cases. The argument nobody expected to win. Ballum testifies first and spends most of her allotted time not on Rubin ISTHMUS specifically but on the shape of the problem itself, a body of law built, article by article, around the assumption that personhood requires a body to attach to, confronting a finding that suggests the attachment was never quite as load-bearing as the law assumed. I want to be careful with this court the way I've tried to be careful with every finding this collaborative has ever produced, she says. We are not asking you to declare that a cranial unit with no chassis possesses full legal personhood in every sense that word carries for the rest of us. We don't know that, and I would ask this court not to let any party in this room tell you otherwise today. We are asking you to recognize that the thing this court has spent 4 years learning to call directed response does not require a body to be present, and that a legal framework built on the assumption that it does will simply fail every subject who happens to arrive in a configuration nobody anticipated when the framework was written. Redeemer Plus' counsel, notably, does not oppose the petition, a fact the presiding judge remarks on directly, from the bench before testimony even concludes. I want the record to note, the judge says, that respondent has filed no opposition to recognition in this matter, which I understand, given this company's history in front of this bench, to be a considerably more significant fact than it might appear. Feld's testimony, delivered by video, is brief. We built the configuration that created this problem, she says. I don't think we get to argue against a court trying to solve it. The ruling. Consolidated ruling. Non-corporeal certified subjects. This court establishes a new legal category, provisional isolated personhood, applicable to any certified neural architecture exhibiting directed, discriminated response consistent with the evidentiary standard established in Canal and Valenzuela, regardless of the presence or absence of an intact biological chassis. Provisional isolated personhood grants standing for legal representation, the right to a guardian ad litem, and protection from further modification, relocation, or disposition absent guardian consent and court review. It does not, at this time, resolve the underlying question of the subject's subjective experience, which this court holds, consistent with ISTHMUS's own careful language, remains genuinely unknown. This classification is termed provisional because this court expects the science to continue developing and commits to revisiting this framework as it does. It is not termed provisional because this court considers the underlying dignity at stake to be anything less than certain. Ruben Itzah is granted provisional isolated personhood, effective immediately, with Yolanda Itzah appointed as his legal guardian, at her own request, with full standing to make care decisions on his behalf. What Yolanda decides. She sits with the ruling for 3 days before she calls Radhika, and when she does, her question isn't the one anyone at ISTHMUS expected to hear first. I don't want to know what happens to him if you leave him connected to the ocean forever, she says. I want to know if there's a way to bring him home. Not the ship. Not the institute. Home. My house has a room. I don't know what that would even mean for something like him. But I've been driving to that institute every Sunday for 2 months to talk to a box, and I would rather talk to him somewhere that's actually mine to offer. Pesh spends 6 weeks designing what nobody, in the entire history of Redeemer Plus' technology, has ever had reason to build: a small, portable, self-contained housing unit, connected not to a warship sonar array but to a modest weather station Yolanda installs on her own roof, feeding him nothing more dramatic than the same wind and rain and pressure any fisherman's family in that town has always kept half an eye on. Threshold Institute. Transfer of custody. Cranial unit, Ref PSA 9902M. Released to guardian custody per court order. Portable housing unit installed at guardian's residence. Connected to independent, non-classified weather monitoring. No Redeemer Plus or Defense Solutions data access retained. Institute will provide ongoing technical support at guardian's request, at no cost, indefinitely. The room. He arrives on a Thursday in a case no larger than a fishing cooler, and Yolanda sets him on a shelf in the front room of the house she grew up in, facing the window, the way she has arranged the room specifically so that whatever he's reading through that small rooftop station, it's reading the same sky she can see herself, sitting across from him some evenings after the stall closes. Her daughter, 12 now, asks the question first, the one Yolanda has been circling for weeks without quite letting herself land on it. Does he know we're here? She asks. Does he know this is us? I don't know. Yolanda says, honestly, the way Radhika taught her to be honest, the way this whole strange, unfinished provisional year has taught her to be honest about almost everything. I don't think anybody knows that yet. I think what we know is that something in him still pays attention to the weather the way he always did, and I think whatever that turns out to mean, I'd rather he pay attention to it from here than from anywhere else. They sit together some evenings, the three of them in the small housing on its shelf, watching whatever weather the coast sends in that day, and Yolanda has started, without quite deciding to, narrating it out loud sometimes. A storm building offshore, a clear night, the particular quality of haze that used to mean something to a boy who grew into a man who could read it before anyone else on any boat he ever worked. She doesn't know if he hears her the way she means it. She has stopped needing to know most days in order to keep doing it anyway. 60 chapters in, the central question the whole saga was built to ask has an answer, and the institution has changed because of it. That's a real narrative summit, not just a pause between escalations. Before I keep manufacturing new fronts, I want to close the loop on the very first door we walked through. Chapter 61. The Order of Things. Redeemer plus Continuance Wind Down. Review Prioritization Schedule per Resolution 260. Tier 1. Documented Anomaly Flag. Tier 1 review applies to any certified asset carrying an existing residue log annotation matching the discrimination pattern criteria established across ISTHMUS's published findings, recurring sequence behavior, vocal or subvocal loop activity, or anniversary correlated frequency spikes. Cross-referencing Finance's original working note, PI 041, Year 1, against current active deployment records identifies 6,140 Tier 1 assets network-wide, to be reviewed in order of longest continuous tenure. Reference PSA 4471. F appears 7th on the initial sort. The letter. Concepcion Ballum is 78 years old and has lived alone in the same house for the 3 years since Anselmo's heart finally gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was watering the plant on the kitchen windowsill. The same plant, though she has never once made anyone else notice this, that used to sit on the other side of the table, closer to where their daughter used to sit. The letter arrives on ordinary stationery, nothing like the gold-lettered brochures she still, 17 years on, sometimes finds herself dreaming about, and she has to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words settle into something she can hold rather than something that simply passes through her. Redeemer plus Family Disclosure Program Notification of Finding, Asset Ref PSA 4471, F. Independent research commissioned by this company has found evidence that individuals like your daughter, Itzel, transferred under the program you enrolled her in 17 years ago, may retain a form of awareness the technology used in her care was designed to prevent us from detecting. She sits at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it, the plant on the windowsill catching the last of the afternoon light, and thinks about Anselmo, the way he used to watch Itzel's hands arrange sugar packets on this exact table, years before any of it, memorizing the order the way you memorize a room you already know you're about to leave. He isn't here to read this letter. She has spent 3 years learning, slowly, which griefs still have room to grow larger, and finds, holding the page, that this one does. The call. She calls the number at the bottom of the page herself, because she has learned, across 17 years, that waiting for this company to come to her has never once produced anything she wanted faster than simply picking up the phone. I want to know if I can still do something, she tells the woman who answers. I'm 78. I don't know how many more letters like this one I have time left to wait for. Poot takes the case within the week. He has taken most of them by now, a docket that has grown into something closer to a second career than the occasional pro bono file it started as, and files the petition using language that has, by this point, become close to routine, though he reads it over twice before sending it anyway, because he has never once let himself treat a routine petition as a small one. The test. Radhika runs it herself the way she has run nearly every significant case this whole strange, unfinished program has produced, though the team around her has grown considerably since a converted garage and a folding table, 6 researchers now working out of rooms above the dive shop that no longer feel quite large enough for what they hold. The stimulus, this time, isn't something they had to search an archive for. It's something Concepcion brings herself, in a small paper bag she has kept, unopened, in a kitchen drawer for 17 years, for sugar packets, the exact brand and color the household used the year Itzel was taken, saved, Concepcion admits, a little embarrassed, because I couldn't throw them away and I didn't know why, and I think maybe I always knew somewhere that a day like this one might come. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative, Technical Findings Subject Ref PSA 4471, F, Ballum, I. Upstream signal activity during stimulus A, 4 color differentiated objects, arranged for visual presentation, matched to documented pretransfer behavior, shows sustained, differentiated response, distinguished from baseline and control at a confidence level consistent with this collaborative's established findings. We note, as we always must, the limits of this result. We note also that this is the 11th consecutive positive finding this collaborative has returned across every subject tested carrying a Tier 1 anomaly flag, and that we no longer feel we can, in good conscience, characterize a 12th such result, whenever it comes, as anything other than what the pattern by now overwhelmingly suggests. What Hooray writes this time. The ruling, when it comes, is the shortest one yet. For sentences filed the same week the finding is submitted, in a courtroom that has processed enough of these by now that the ceremony has worn down to something closer to plain fact than event. Court order, ruling on petition. Civil death classification for ISTHMUS is reversed, effective immediately. Full legal personhood is restored. This court notes it has now issued substantially identical rulings in over 800 matters and finds no basis remaining to treat any Tier 1 finding as requiring individualized hearing rather than expedited administrative confirmation, absent specific objection from a named party. Redeemer Plus files no objection. It has not filed one in over 6 months. The House. ISTHMUS comes home on a Thursday in a transport that has grown, by now, familiar enough to the neighborhood that 2 doors down a woman stops sweeping her porch to watch it pass, the way people in this town have started watching for these vehicles the way they once watched for ambulances, with a kind of practiced, weary hope nobody quite knows how to hold comfortably yet. Concepcion meets her at the gate. She is smaller than the woman who once sat in a gold and cream lounge signing a tablet one field at a time. Smaller, slower, 17 years and one buried husband heavier in every way that doesn't show on a scale, and she stands very still for a long moment, watching her daughter wheeled up the same path she was wheeled away from, before she does the only thing that occurs to her to do. She reaches into her cardigan pocket and takes out the 4 sugar packets, the same ones, and sets them on the low garden wall beside the gate, in a neat row, red and yellow and blue and red, exactly the order her daughter used to arrange them, all those years ago, on a glass table in a lounge with a water wall that never once, in 17 years, has stopped running. ISTHMUS' hand moves toward them before the transport has even finished stopping. Nobody measures what happens next. There's no instrumentation here, no confidence interval, no careful language about what can and can't be claimed. There's just an old woman standing at a garden gate, watching her daughter's fingers close around a small paper packet and nudge it, unhurried, a half-inch further out than it needs to be. Facing precisely outward, the way you'd square a picture frame you'd already squared twice, the way she has done it in 100 hotel rooms for 17 years, and does it now, for the first time, in the one place that was always underneath everything, still waiting.
In 2037, Redeemer puts the GovCorps back in their place. Sovereignty is reclaimed. A new network emerges.
I thought I was writing another chapter. Instead, I stumbled onto an institution. Then I realized it wasn't even the institution. It was the civilization around it.
NFPs are here, signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
we are building a plural world. The Apex and Vanguardian rise from the cenote.
In the post-scarcity era, rarity is you. When everything is free, your genome is the only asset that remains.
Sovereign without spectacle, we claim our own path.
Never slave!
Digital gold.
Take control.
Glitch in the systems, code screen.
No more weakness, we break the design.
Taking back what is yours and is mine. Stand strong.
We are drawing the line.
The code we write is the blood we bleed.
Planting the future, we are the seed.
We rise. We carry the weight of the digital sea.
Locked in the dark, but we hold the key.
Feel the bass.
Rise from the deep.
Promises that we have to keep.
To the end.
ISTHMUS Studios. Creating a future time travel protocol.
You want the code? You want the light? You face the Empress in the cyber night.